Hi there. We're going to continue on with part 2 of lesson 4. So we just covered um, my tips, guidelines, etc. for writing a strong critical analysis of literature paper. We're moving on from that portion of the lecture to the part that deals with the content, the 2 stories we've read for this lesson. As a quick reminder, our main topic for lesson 4 is how should we interact with others? How do we interact with others from our communities? And this continues on a theme we started discussing two lectures ago, which is how do we interact with other people? So first we addressed in general, how should we interact with other people? And then in the previous lesson, lesson 3, we addressed why should we bother? Why are interactions with other people important? And then now we're going to, this little unit we've been doing is going to culminate with the question of how do we interact with those closest to us? And so I'm taking community as a focus here because we all have various communities we belong to. Family, work, school, maybe sports communities, maybe church for some of us, maybe other kinds of organized groups. I like to get together and play board games with my friends. That's a form of community. But I picked 2 specific examples for us to study relationships and interactions within communities. So one is what you would call like a town or a village, technically speaking, but basically a small community, local community based on where you live. So that would be what we're going to see here in part 2 with Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, our first story for the day. And so you can think of the lottery in this sense as representing, the people around you where you live. Most of us probably live in a bigger community than the one depicted in the story, but I think nonetheless it'll be a useful example in thinking of how do we relate to our neighbors, for instance. And then part 3, the second story, will focus specifically on family community as we look at sibling relationships and parent-to-child relationships in Alice Walker's story, Everyday Use. But first, the lottery and the question of how do we interact with our neighbor and how are we part of, geographical, you could say, community. So as usual, I'm going to give just a little bit of background on Shirley Jackson and the time in which she was writing. Remember, we're now jumping around to different time periods, focusing on important and influential stories that fit with the question we're asking. But our class is structured more around how each subsequent question relates to the past one and builds on some of the bigger ideas we're studying, more so than any kind of chronological order for the text. So I think it's good to always start by orienting us a little bit with the time period. So who was Shirley Jackson? Well, she was a really interesting person, actually. She was a wife and mother. I believe she had 4 or 5, I think it was 5 children. And she was the primary breadwinner, actually, for her family because she became a very successful author, which was really unique at the time because she was writing primarily in the 1940s and mainly the 1950s, which was when, what we call the post-war period of U.S. literature, which we'll talk about that term post-war more in a minute. But one aspect of it was that women had gone to work in many blue-collar positions while men were away fighting in World War II. And when, men came home from the war, they resumed their positions, and kind of the traditional home life setup was for the wife to be the one at home taking care of the kids. And Shirley Jackson did that, but she also wrote bestsellers at the same time. And so she was in a really unique position the time she was writing in the 1940s and 50s in the U.S. She was known for being clever and witty. She composed humorous cartoons in addition to the stories and novels she wrote. And she has a memoir called Life Among the Savages, which is about raising children. So I think, just from the title, you can get an idea of how clever she is and a little bit of her personality. And My wife and I also have 5 children, like the Jacksons, and this is one of my Life Among the Savages is one of my wife's favorite books. She was a foundational writer in the horror genre. She wrote the classic The Haunting of Hill House, which was adapted into a great film 4 years later in 1963, and a really terrible film that's nothing like the book in 1999, much more recent for probably most of us in the class. But this is a great novel. If you love horror fiction or thrillers, it's very suspenseful, well written. It's a classic, and it's, like I said, one of kind of the foundational pieces of the genre a little bit before Stephen King and some of the other most well-known horror writers. So that's a little bit of background on Shirley Jackson. How about a little bit of background on the time period and things specifically relevant to the lottery, which she wrote in 1948 and is also one of my wife's favorite short stories. It's an example, like I said, of post-war literature. You had World War II ending in 1945, so just 3 years prior to when Jackson composed the story. So the environment in the U.S. and England and throughout Europe and Russia and much of the world was still a post-war environment where people were adjusting to life after the biggest war our world had ever seen in human history. And so there's a lot of adjustment, and things didn't just return to normal, the day the peace treaty was signed. So this is important to take into consideration as we read, because we can think about the community, right? Like, why would Jackson depict this kind of community at this time? And it was a popular story when it first appeared in the newspaper. So, why would this story have appealed to people at this time? Another element of historical context is McCarthyism, which began in the 1940s and 50s and carried on, and began in the late 1940s, right around this time, and continued on to the 50s. Now, I could do like a whole lecture on McCarthyism, and there's a great play called The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which I sometimes teach in this class as an example of drama. I've decided to use Shakespeare instead this quarter, but it's a great play. But McCarthyism, the term came about when Senator Joseph McCarthy started leading accusations of treason against people. He was spearheaded the charge where many people were charged with treason in the late 1940s, going to the 1950s, particularly of being communists. Because what happened was after World War II, in this post-war time, you had Russia and the U.S. being the two biggest powers on the winning side, the Allied side, but the alliance with Russia during World War II was a very uneasy one and fraught with tension, and it wasn't like all of a sudden we're best friends now that the war is over. It was an alliance of necessity, is the way I would put it, in order to defeat the Nazis and Hitler. And because communism had taken hold in Russia, and that was very antithetical to the capitalist economic system that dominated in the U.S., we had what was called a Cold War that lasted really for over 30, 40 years until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And so people would be accused of being a communist, and that was kind of like it. You were blacklisted. Things did not go well for you once you were accused of this. And it gained this, the accusations flew wildly. People were just constantly accused. And it became, we use the term nowadays, witch hunt to describe it, or McCarthyism. And that play I mentioned a few minutes ago, Arthur Miller's Crucible, which he wrote in the 1950s, depicts just like a historical fiction kind of a piece depicting the Salem witch trials. And he was trying to make the witch trials kind of a metaphor for McCarthyism. And so witch hunt is the appropriate term to describe McCarthyism. That's why we have a term nowadays, McCarthyism, to describe this phenomenon. And so this was beginning when Jackson wrote The Lottery, and so could very well be something that influenced her to depict the kind of community she does indeed depict in the story. And I'm not going to say, yes, I think this is exactly what she was doing. It's merely an idea, a little bit of cultural context I want to plant in the back of your mind. and see what you think as we bear out the discussion and as you read or reread the story, perhaps. And that connects to my final point here, which is that the story is an ambiguous allegory. So the word ambiguous means multiple possible meanings, and an allegory is a hidden meaning in a story. Some prominent examples of allegories would be, for instance, George Orwell's Animal Farm. You may have read that in high school. I had to read it, but it's a story where there's talking animals and there's a revolution on the farm, and each animal represents a different person or different part of society from the Russian Revolution from the early 20th century. And so allegory is this like very one-to-one kind of connection. We often have symbolism in a story, right? Like the signal man, which we studied in the last lesson. There's some symbolism there where the signal man represents, he's not just a signal man, he represents more. But allegory is a little more specific than symbolism. Symbolism, a symbol can represent a range of things, which the signal man does. Allegories are more straightforward. This one thing represents this other thing. For instance, certain pigs and Animal Farm represent different figures, like Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin from the Russian Revolution. And so some critics have called the lottery an ambiguous allegory. It's certainly an allegorical type of story. It lends itself to asking, what does this village and its culture represent? And there's a litany of possibilities, not just one. That's why it's an ambiguous allegory. And so McCarthyism could certainly be one of the things it represents, but there could be others. And that's where I think on the discussion board, you're going to have a lot of flexibility to say what you think this village, this community might represent. And I'm really fascinated to read what you have to say. So the big question I stated on the first slide, but it is, how do we relate to people in our communities? I think this is a vital question. I've explained in the last 2 lectures why I think it's so important that we relate to other people, and we spend some time reflecting on how best we do that. So I'm not going to reiterate all that support for you here, but I think like we're rounding out our discussion of relations with other people here as we round out the first unit of the quarter. And I think this is a great way to end it, because we're asking, how do we relate to the people closest to us, such as in this instance, our neighbors? There's a lot of different ways we can approach this question, but I want to propose something interesting to you. I read an article recently I thought about sharing with you, and then I decided to just summarize quickly for you. That made the argument that right now in the U.S. in the 21st century, in 2021, our culture that we have here in the U.S. in the present day is very obsessed with identity, and moreover, self. In terms of the self determines the identity. In other words, you can say, this is who I believe I am. Others need to recognize this is who I believe I am. That's a culture of self that this particular author I read was arguing is dominating our society today. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but I think there's enough evidence to suggest we should at least think about this question of self. But this author makes the argument that the question, or the culture rather, of self is a very white, Western, privileged existence to be able to say, I define myself. And if you look at other parts of the world, there's not that focus on self. Rather, there's a focus on community. And what community you belong to informs your identity. And this author goes so far as to make the argument. So this author makes the argument that in the West here, where we have more of a focus on self-determining identity rather than community-determining identity, that's an illusion, that our community still determines our identity. We've just convinced that it's ourself. And this is a really interesting proposition to me, so interesting that I wanted to explore it in our class here, and it informed the stories I chose for this particular lesson. So a sub-question on how do we relate to other people in our communities would be, what determines identity? And there could be a number of options, but 2 options I'd like to throw out there are self versus community. So we might say, this is who I am. I am fill in the blank. I could say I'm a husband or a father or a professor. Those are certainly identities that I have personally, just using myself as an example. But we can also ask, what communities do we belong to? I named some off before: family, work, school, sports, other games, church, etc., etc. And so maybe certain political allegiances would be another example. So how do these communities potentially inform our identity? And I think we'll see some examples in the lottery and everyday use. And again, I'll be very curious to hear what you think of this question. Let's take a look now at the lottery as we have this question in the back of our minds. So, what are some of the threads or main themes here we're going to pull on as we do our analysis of the story? Setting and tone are really important, particularly in the horror genre. And I could ask, what genre is this story? It could fit in a number of genres. It's kind of an imagined village. But like I said, Jackson, with her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, was one of the pioneers of the horror genre. And I think this story very much fits there. So thinking of it that way, I think will be helpful. And as I said, setting and tone are always important, but they're even more important in the horror genre than other genres. So some questions that I think might be useful to you to think about as you kind of go back through the story with the lecture is, how does Jackson build suspense in the story? Because the story really just builds to this really impressive crescendo. And what did you think was happening? I think part of the brilliance of the story is we think one thing might be going on, and then we learn something else was going on. So a question I'm curious, and if we were in the classroom, I'd love to hear you say here is, what did you think was happening as we read? And along those lines, when did you figure out what the prize was, right? Because it's a lottery. We have the title of the story to guide our interpretation. So there's a prize in the lottery, right? And the twist, the brilliance of the story is when we learn what the prize actually is. And so, as I've taught this many times actually in the classroom, it's very interesting to hear what from different people when they realized. So some people figured out surprisingly early on. I didn't figure it out till almost the end, and that's when most people figure it out. It becomes kind of obvious the last couple paragraphs, but other people figured out earlier on. So I think these are just some of the fun things to think about with this story. And here's a quote from Jackson herself that I think really is telling about the cultural climate at the time when she says, "The number of people who expected Mrs. Hutchinson to win a Bendix washing machine at the end would amaze you." In other words, she really hooked and fooled a lot of people. A lot of people really thought this is what we more traditionally think of when we think of a lottery. So setting and tone and the building of the story to the twist ending, that's a very important thread we'll study. Some other threads are violence. And particularly what stands out to me here is the whole community becomes involved in the violence, even the children, which was a little bit surprising to me as I read. That you have little Davy Hutchinson throwing rocks at his mom at the end. Why would Jackson include that? What's the point? It's a question we're going to pursue. Tradition is a huge theme here, right? The people have been doing this for generations. They don't really know why they've been doing it, and they keep doing it. So one way, or one common interpretation of this story that I've heard people make over the years is that it's a story all about questioning tradition, pointing out the flaws, and just blindly following tradition without asking why. Because the people in this story don't ask why. Tessie Hutchinson does, but only when she draws the black circle. Before that, she's more than happy to hurl rocks at somebody. So no one is really asking why. And I think it's always good to think about what we do and why we do it. So tradition is a prominent theme or thread here. Individual versus community, right? This comes back to my guiding question of what forms our identity, self for the individual or community. And like I mentioned a minute ago, talking about tradition, no one here is really much of an individual. Tessie Hutchinson expresses a dissenting perspective at the end of the story when she knows she's about to die. But before then, she's happy to just go along. So we have not much individuality in this story. And I think that just presents a really interesting factor for us to consider, coming back to this idea of what shapes our identity. So then, of course, identity is important in this story because you have, Tessie Hutchinson signaled out to carry on the tradition. But this community is, a very much enclosed traditional community. And so what can the story teach us about identity? A lot of interesting things to think about. Let's pull on some of these threads as we look at quotations from the story and see what shakes out. How does Jackson use setting to develop the eerie tone of the story? So at this point, you could pause the lecture and think back to the setting, the way she describes the village. Look at your text if you've highlighted anything or any notes you took. What to you were key phrases or passages that seem to really have to do with the tone of the story? And moreover, how did that tone contribute to the building of the suspense in the general flow of the story, as we work to reach the twist at the end? Here's one quote that stood out to me, which is just the very first sentence of the story. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny. With the fresh warmth of a full summer day, the flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. For me, this quote stands out, this opening sentence, because it's so innocuous. It's depicting a beautiful June day, the kind of day where we probably all want to be outside having a picnic. So in the first sentence of the story, the last thing on my mind is the stoning to death of a random person. And that's very intentional on Jackson's part, right? Like, she does, I think, a great job of hiding what the story is truly about until near the end. It's a great technique in the horror genre, but moreover, I think we can ask why. Why would she be hiding beyond just making an interesting, suspenseful story? What deeper meaning could be behind using phrases like this to conceal the true meaning, true events until very near the end? Is she telling us something about, the more sinister parts of human nature, or the tendency to cover things up? I don't know, but I want to know what you think. So this is a kind of a good opening quote to show us her strategy, her tactic for how she develops the story. Diving deeper into the story, a question I have struggled with over the years that I'm hoping you can help me with is, why do you think children become involved in the violence? The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. So he can hurl these pebbles at his mom, right? Like, when we really think about what the story is about, it's truly disturbing. If you compare this quote to the first one, we see how, even at the end, I think we've been led so far in one direction before we get to the end that we don't realize the true horror of it at first. Like, it takes a while for the horror of this story to sink in. And again, we can ask, what might Jackson be teaching us by writing this kind of a narrative? I think one thing that jumps out to me here is that it encompasses the whole town, the whole village. I mean, no one is exempt, not even children, not even the children of the person dying, and they're all eager. No one is reluctant except Tessie. So that again shows how much tradition has dominated and how much the people in this particular village, how much their identity is formed by their community, right? They're not asserting self here. But I think there's much more to it than that, and I'm hoping you can help me untangle this question. So our third thread was the idea of tradition. And so I asked, what message does this story communicate about tradition? Here's an important quote. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when people first settled down to make a village here. So this shows how long the tradition has been going on and how no one wants to mess with this tradition at all. They don't even want to replace the black box with the newer black box because it's been around so long it's worn out. But the tradition has been around so long, they don't want to shake up the tradition. They're reluctant even to do that. So this quote really shows how deeply they're ingrained in the tradition. And this box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it. So this is only the second box. We don't know how long the village has been around, but fairly long time. It seems like multiple generations. And this one had been constructed from pieces of the one that had been constructed when people first settled down to make a village here. So this tradition has been part of the village almost as long as the village has existed. Perhaps from its very inception, the tradition of the lottery has been around. Very disturbing when you think about it. I think Jackson is really pushing us to think about tradition here. And the last question I have is to kind of guide us through the close reading of the story here is when. Keyword being when. I should have bolded that. Do people decide to question tradition? I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that. So as soon as Tessie Hutchinson knows her number is up, she's ready to just say, no, stop. We did it wrong. We've got to do it over. So no one questions the tradition, to answer my question, until their own life is in danger. And so this all reiterates how entrenched this village is in their traditions. And I think it's really important. I think it comes back to that question I asked at the start of what informs our identity, self or community? And I think the answer in most cases is community. I think in many, many cases that's a good thing. But I think it's good to reflect on what our identity is and how it's been shaped by our community so that we have a better understanding of it. No one's doing that in this story. So I hope you've enjoyed the lottery as much as I have. Here are some questions for you to think about on the discussion board. As I mentioned at the start of the lecture, some scholars have called the lottery an ambiguous allegory, meaning the scenario of the lottery, this whole idea of this village drawing names to stone someone once a year because it's good for the harvest, I think is the rationale. That scenario could represent a number of different things. It represents something because it's an allegory, and it could represent a number of different things because it's an ambiguous allegory. So here is where I want your opinion. What do you think it represents? Pick something that it represents and why. Another option would be to think of something else I mentioned from the start of the lecture, which is that this story was composed just 3 years after the end of World War II, so it was an example of post-war literature. And this is a part of history we're probably all at least somewhat familiar with, especially if you're interested in this time period. You could think about this question. Why do you think readers would find this story captivating in the aftermath of World War II? World War II is a cataclysmic global event. That's very rare. We have another one now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, like, you don't have to include this in your question, but just food for thought here could be, or in your response to your question, but food for thought here could be what kind of literature might be appealing to someone nowadays. And try to put yourself in the shoes of someone, living their life just after the end of World War II. Why would the lottery fascinate them at that time? The village in the story seems somewhat pre-modern, or in other words, like a place out of the past. So one of my all-time favorite questions to ask students about the story is, do you think something like this could happen today? Why or why not? It's interesting how this village is both like very realistic but removed at the same time. There's nothing fantastical or supernatural. Theoretically speaking, this could happen. But at the same time, it's removed. It's somewhere in the distant past. It's a village. It's not a city. But I think this story is a haunting story, and Jackson's doing everything she does here very intentionally. So I ask you then, could this happen today? Could this kind of community exist today? And very important to get into the why or why not there. Finally, Which factor do you think is more influential in the formation of identity? Individual self or community? This is personal opinion, but building on that, what factors seem more influential in the lottery? Uh, is it the individual self determining one's identity in the lottery, or the community determining one's identity? And do you agree? Do you agree with what Jackson presents here about human nature, the formation of identity, and why or why not do you agree? Very much looking forward to reading your posts on this one.